Conclusion. I have tried in this book to do a number of things and would like here to review the ground I have covered. I hope that in working through the concepts of liberal jurisprudence and the various phases of Marxist critique, I have been able to clarify certain areas which have hitherto been neglected or misunderstood, as well as providing pointers for future theoretical work. Certain practical political conclusions also follow from the analysis I have provided. I have argued first for a recognition and reappraisal of the achievements of liberal jurisprudence in its classical phase. These lay essentially in its exposition of private property, law, and the state as the fundamental categories of juridic thought, in its discovery that they are the products of human activity and not simply given in nature, in its elaboration of the historical conditions required for their emergence, in its analysis of the contradictions running through them, and in its attempts to resolve these contradictions through the institutions of new forms of private property, law, and state. At the same time, classical jurisprudence was by no means a homogeneous discourse. I have tried to trace some of the steps in its uneven development and some of the major differences which run through it. Nonetheless, its proponents constructed for themselves a definite historical and logical identity around the elaboration of these themes. In one respect, however, classical jurisprudence fell short of the more radical variants of liberal thought that developed in the 19th century. None of the classical writers were Democrats. Nonetheless, they offered a much richer foundation for the growth of a Marxist critique of jurisprudence than did the representatives of, quote, vulgar jurisprudence, end quote, who followed them. This decline of liberal thought has not been the topic of my work. Suffice it to say that vulgar jurisprudence lost sight of the genesis of private property, law, and the state and human activity, their determinate social character which differentiated them from other forms of property and authority, their historical origin and the contradictions and antagonism inherent in their functioning. It treated them instead as unproblematic, natural, eternal, harmonious, ideal attributes of all social organization. In so doing, it blunted the critical edge of classical jurisprudence and subordinated the scientific inquiry into the legitimation and service of bourgeois property and authority. Marx's ongoing dialogue with the works of Smith and Hegel bears testimony to the seriousness with which he treated them. It was because he recognized the great advance in scientific and political thought achieved by classical jurisprudence. Marx's ongoing dialogue with the works of Smith and Hegel bears testimony to the seriousness with which he treated them. It was because he recognized the great advance in scientific and political thought achieved by classical jurisprudence that he studied and criticized its writings with such care. His object was not simply to reject liberalism, a goal which he shared with all kinds of radicals and reactionaries, but to move beyond liberalism. It is possible, of course, to be anti-liberal without being pro-Marx, and necessary to demarcate the boundaries of Marx's own critique. Marx himself warred against socialists of his time who offered an anti-liberalism which fell short of liberalism. Marx thus applauded classical jurisprudence for reducing juridic institutions to, quote, man himself, end quote, and for its repudiation of traditional natural law theory. His critique was founded not on a restoration of natural law, but on completing the break from natural law, which classical jurisprudence initiated. Whilst classical jurisprudence discovered that human labor is the source of private property, law, and the state, it reintroduced a concept of natural law by supposing that it is in the nature of human labor in general to express itself in these juridic forms. The question Marx posed was under what conditions, what relations of production, does the labor of individuals create private property, law, and the state as its products? The point was not simply to reject the category of human labor generated within classical jurisprudence, a category which made possible the growth of juridic science, but rather to specify the definite historical relations under which it operated, such that private property, law, and the state emerged as its products. Similarly, Marx argued that the ideas of freedom and equality put forward within classical jurisprudence as both a theoretical conclusion and a political demand were themselves a product of history. They express the development of bourgeois relations of production in which class relations between labor and capital take the form of free and equal exchange between independent owners of private property. Marx demonstrated the formal character of freedom and equality in their abstraction from class relations of production, not in order to condemn the illusoriness of liberal ideas, but to reveal the limited character of their realization within liberalism. Marx's critique of liberal jurisprudence did not come about in a single flash of inspiration, nor did it reach any final point of culmination. Rather, Marx's critique of liberal jurisprudence was developed in stages, each stage containing within itself internal tensions and limitations, which Marx then sought to resolve with the growth of his theoretical and political armory. In the first stage, Marx appropriated the liberal concept of the rational state as a synthesis of individual liberty and the universal will of the whole, but he looked carefully at the actual state which liberals presented as the embodiment of this ideal and found it wanting. Marx gave to the concept of the rational state a far more democratic content than that given to the concept of the rational state by the liberals. The abolition of the monarchy, of bureaucratic administration, of the House of Lords, and all legal privileges, the institution of active and passive universal suffrage, the collection of officials and judges as well as deputies, strict accountability of those elected to their electors, all power to the assembly, rule through general and determinate laws impartially adjudicated and administered, the independence of the judiciary from the executive and review of executive decisions by the judiciary, popular participation in politics outside of Parliament, the guarantee of substantive rights for a free press, freedom of speech, free association, and free trade unionism. Such, Marx argued, were the real presuppositions of a rational state, which no actual state came anywhere near to embodying. I guess that's a free association, not quite in the context of, not quite meaning what the title of my YouTube channel means, but it's fun. Marx's second stage was no longer to reveal the gulf between the ideal and the actual state, but also to reveal the limitations of mere political emancipation. Thus he contrasted the universality and freedom inherent in the idea of the state with the egoism, inequality, alienation, and dependence associated with private property. The same historical process which released the public domain from its private fetters also released the pursuit of private interest from all social obligations. Political emancipation through the construction of a rational state was not enough, for by itself it was compatible with enslavement within civil society. On the other hand, political emancipation was necessary, for there could be no social emancipation without political liberty. Marx's critique was thus aimed both at those who equated political emancipation with human emancipation tout court, and at those who counterposed socialism to political emancipation. Marx's third stage was no longer to contrast the rationality of the state to the irrationality of civil society, but also to reveal the alienated social character of the rational state itself. By its very nature, the state represents the alienation of power from the mass of the people and the communality that is purely formal. Even the most democratic state falls short of full democracy, since the existence of the state itself is a negation of democracy. The abstract quality of the state means not only that political liberty by itself is insufficient, but also that political liberty entails the expropriation of power from the people. The formal character of freedom and equality before the law means not only that they are by themselves insufficient, but also that they engender unfreedom and inequality as their substantive consequence. In Hegelian terms, Marx now recognized that the realization of reason required not the reconstruction, but the dissolution of the state in the state's entirety. Rather than counterpose the universality of the state to the particularity of civil society, Marx now derived the purely formal freedom and equality inherent in the state from the purely formal freedom and equality inherent in civil society. In reality, beneath the surface, both private property and the state had enslavement and alienation as the roots of their mutual existence. Human emancipation required the withering away of the state and of law alongside that of private property. Private property, law, and the state no longer appeared as antagonistic social forces, but as mutually complementary. It is this stage which, if taken in isolation from the texts which came before and after it, gives most support to a, quote, reductionist, end quote, or, quote, instrumentalist, end quote, view of Marx's juridic theory of law and the state. The final stages of Marx's critique of jurisprudence have to be reconstructed from comments dispersed through his economic, political, and historical writings, and most importantly, from the method which he employed in his critique of political economy. Marx's focus on political economy in his later theoretical writings can give rise to the impression that economic relations constitute the fundamental base of capitalist society, and that juridic forms are illusory, derivative, or in some sense, quote, epiphenomenal, end quote. This was a view which Marx never entirely abandoned, but jostling with it was another conception of the relation between jurisprudence and economics, which I have sought to bring to the surface and in some respects to develop. In this alternative account, Marx put forward the hypothesis that capitalist relations of production express themselves at one and the same time through the juridic forms of private property, law, and the state, and the economic forms of value, price, money, capital, profit, and so on. Neither space, juridic or economic, is logically privileged. Rather, their, quote, base, end quote, or what Marx now referred to as their mutual, quote, content, end quote, is seen as comprising social relations of production, which at a particular stage of their evolution necessarily give rise to both the juridic and the economic spheres. Juridic forms, like economic forms, are transitory and historical and cannot be understood in isolation from the social relations which lie concealed within them. There is no theoretical warrant for saying that economic forms are, quote, more real, end quote, than juridic forms. They coexist as the mutually required ways in which definite productive relations must express themselves, and it is a one-sided Marxism which concentrates exclusively on the economic aspects. Marx's use of the metaphor, quote, form content, end quote, rather than that of, quote, base superstructure, end quote, also points to his belief that the juridic forms of productive relations are every bit as real as the productive relations themselves. The form or surface of an object is as, quote, material, end quote, as its inner content. From this perspective, forms of law, contract, equal exchange, etc., should not be conceived as mere masks concealing class relations, but rather as real mediations. On the other hand, the form of an object cannot be separated from the object's content. So juridic forms should not be abstracted as timeless ideals apart from the relations between individuals which give rise to those juridic forms. Bourgeois justice is neither simply a camouflage for class domination nor an eternal truth dissociated from bourgeois justice's class origins. Marx's critique of jurisprudence was thus based not on the substitution of one juridic theory for another, but on a social critique of jurisprudence as a whole. Theoretically, Marx sought to explain the social base of juridic forms and of the categories which express them. Practically, he sought the dissolution of the juridic sphere in its entirety, i.e. the abolition of private property, law, and the state alongside the abolition of the law of value, money, and capital, as part and parcel of what is required for the transition from capitalism to socialism. Marx offered at this stage a more dialectical critique of the contradictions between juridic forms of freedom and equality and their class content in capitalist society than he had previously been able to do. The key to this shift lay in his investigation of private property, in which he abandoned a number of his earlier assumptions. In particular, he now saw that the concept of private property referred not to the economic base of law and the state, but was itself the simplest juridic form, and therefore had a direct connection with law and the state as more developed juridic forms. Thus, the relation between private property and the law is not one between the economic and the juridic, but a relation within the juridic sphere alone. Marx resisted the tendency of some theorists to divorce private property law and the state from one another, as if private property law and the state were representative of entirely different principles. It thus makes no sense to contrast law as an unqualified human good to private property as a bourgeois evil. At the same time, Marx resisted the tendency of other theorists to identify private property law and the state as with one another. At the same time, Marx resisted the tendency of other theorists to identify private property law and the state with one another, as if they all refer to the same basic principle or relation, which is the assumption of those who derive private property law and the state equally from the exchange of commodities. Rather, he saw one as a developed form of the other, just as money is a developed form of value and capital is a developed form of money. The hypothesis which Marx hinted at, and which I have here elaborated, is that simple commodity production gives rise to private property. The generalization of commodity production gives rise to law, and the transformation of commodity into capitalist production gives rise to the state. Within the general context of the capitalist productive relations, changing relations between labor and capital give rise to quite distinct forms of the state and distinct relationships between private property, the law, the state executive, and parliament. Further, in the socialist transition, new and more democratic forms of private property, law, and the state should emerge, leading eventually to their dissolution under communist relations of production. With the development of higher forms of juridic life, the lower forms do not cease to exist but acquire new functions. At the same time, Marx's approach reveals the inherently contradictory character of these forms. The emergence of law may serve to resolve some of the antagonisms associated with the pursuit of private property, and the emergence of the state may serve to resolve some of the contradictions associated with the law. But in each case, new contradictions necessarily emerge. The question of the emergence of definite juridic forms and that of their function and uses once they have emerged are distinct, and no symmetry can be presupposed between them. Thus, the generalization of commodity production creates a need for new forms of regulation to sustain, quote, free and equal exchange, end quote, in the face of inevitable divisions between rich and poor. At the same time, it creates the means for meeting this need in the form of law. But there can be no guarantee concerning the adequacy of this form for fulfilling this function. Marx's method entails a rejection both of functionalism, that is, the reduction of juridic forms to their functions, and of formalism, the reduction of juridic functions to their forms. In their place, he urges us to examine the necessarily contradictory ways in which private property, law, and the state serve to reproduce capitalist relations of production. Marx abandoned the one-sidedness of his earlier critique of private property, in which he had revealed its alienated and exploitative social content, but dismissed its formal qualities of free will, equality, and universality as fictions concealing enslavement and mere egoism. He now combined a critique of the alien social content of private property with an appreciation of the real significance of its formal attributes. He now explained, though there were tensions in his position which he never resolved, that while the freedom, equality, and universality associated with wage labor are compatible with class subordination, freedom, equality, and universality are nonetheless material factors which give capitalism's emancipatory potential. Under capitalism, he now argued, workers are not commodities at all, but the owners of commodities, quote, with their own need for development, end quote. The derivation of juridic forms from relations of commodity exchange led either to their idealization as embodiments of freedom, equality, and justice, or to their dismissal as embodiments of egoism, conflict, and mutual indifference, depending on one's view of the exchange relation. Marx now argued that both were partial truths, both equally abstract exchange from the relations of production which engender exchange. Thus, the different contents of private property under commodity, capitalist, and socialist relations of production is obscured as long as analysis remains on the surface of exchange relations. So too, while equality before the law always entails inequality in fact, because the individuals are treated according to one set of dimensions alone and not according to their needs, nevertheless the degree and nature of this inequality undergoes radical shifts between and within commodity, capitalist, and socialist societies. Thus, the general inequality existing between capital and labor in no way obviates the fact that the relation between capital and labor is not fixed once and for all, but is one in which labor may acquire more or less influence, recognition, and share of wealth. One cannot speak of the legal form in the singular, if this is taken to mean that all legal forms are essentially the same. Private property, law, and the state take quite different forms under different relations of production, and one form may be far preferable to another form. Private property, law, and the state take quite different forms under different relations of production, and one form may be far preferable to another from the perspective of democracy, individual liberty, social equality, and the production of wealth. The fact that, in general, private property, law, and the state represent a restrictive freedom, a restrictive equality, and a restrictive fraternity, and that the contradictions associated with them cannot finally be resolved within a juridic framework, does not mean that we can ignore the differences between their various forms and contents. Marx sought to transcend private property, law, and the state, not because he was skeptical of democracy, but because of the limits which juridic forms impose upon democracy, at the same time as he recognized its progressiveness as a means of expressing what Hegel had called a synthesis between the universal will of all and the particular will of the individual. He also exposed the limits of the synthesis possible within the narrow horizons of jurisprudence. Thus, when Marx referred to the withering away of private property, law, and the state, he had in mind not merely their abolition, but also their replacement by more democracy, more individual liberty than is possible within their confines, the confines of private property, law, and the state. Ripped out of context, the concept of, quote, withering away, end quote, does not rule out the possibility that private property may be dissolved in favor of state property. That law may be dissolved in favor of bureaucracy, or that the state may be dissolved, as various fascist thinkers put it, in favor of the community and the leader. For Marx, the withering away of juridic forms signified a process of democratization, an extension of individual rights to the point of the dissolution of the juridic sphere in the juridic sphere's entirety, rather than counterposing the juridic sphere's democratization to the juridic sphere's withering away. Marx saw one as the culmination of the other. Where does this leave us today? Workers value their liberties and are right to do so. Workers value the right to think and act for themselves as individuals. The civil liberties which protect them from arbitrary authority, the economic freedom to join a trade union and to withdraw their labor, the political liberty to elect a government, protest against bad laws, and remove from power those who oppress them. Thus, it is no part of working-class politics to reduce private property, law, and the state to mere instruments of the ruling class, or mere functions for the reproduction of class relations. A socialist politics which debases the coinage of individual liberty and political democracy, or which presents private property, law, and the state as mere negations of individual liberty and political democracy, is unlikely to win favor among those it would champion, not because workers are bedeviled by false consciousness, but because workers understand what is important to them. The task of Marxism is not to negate this working-class consciousness, but to encourage its growth by giving it theoretical expression. Those who tell workers that democracy is a bourgeois illusion or that individual liberty is a bourgeois vice may see themselves as very radical, and the workers who ignore them as very backwards. But on such occasions, the workers may well be more advanced than those who would lead them. We are sometimes told, for example, that socialist democracy transcends free elections, that workers' rights to strike are narrow and selfish, that individual freedom is no more than an illusion or a bourgeois vice, that workers' own organizations can express the will of the working class regardless of the extent to which the workers themselves have a say in those organizations running, that state property is socialist even though workers have no control over state property's use and are punished for interfering with state property. A form of socialism has developed that reflects in a grotesque way the formalism which Marx detected in Hegel, whereby the people are treated with obsequious courtesy as long as they silently haunt the antechambers of power, but find the doors to the inner chambers barred and a notice up saying, quote, reserved for public business, no admission to the public, end quote, which may have originated as a temporary measure subordinating democracy to the class struggle, has turned into a general disregard for democracy in the name of class struggle. For example, the suppression of workers' rights to organize independently of the state is no more acceptable because the state declares itself socialist than it is in a capitalist state. This is why Lenin was right to argue in 1920 and 1921 against those who wished to subordinate trade unions to the socialist state, that trade unions should retain their rights to defend, quote, the material and spiritual interest, end quote, of the workers against the workers' state, not merely, as he put it, because the, quote, workers' state, end quote, was actually a, quote, workers' and peasants' state, end quote, and because it suffered from bureaucratic distortions, but because the state is in its essence a power alien to labor. A working-class politics such as that enunciated by Marx declares the stubborn refusal of workers to surrender their rights, whether they are asked to do so in the name of democracy, conceived of as something apart from the real will of individuals, or in the name of a socialism viewed as something apart from the people who constitute that socialism.